Well, for more on Asia's economic outlook, Daniel Ryntjes spoke to Kenneth Kang, Deputy Director of the IMF's Asia and Pacific Department. Daniel began by asking about the IMF's financial expectations for the region.
Well, for China, in our report, we have significantly upgraded our outlook for growth. We expect growth to be at 6.8% this year and 6.5% next year. For this year, the upper revision mainly reflects the stronger growth momentum. For next year and for the medium term, the upper revision reflects expectations that policies will be expansionary, in line with the government's objective to double 2010 GDP by 2020. But you're right to point out that this upper revision also reflects higher debt and higher risk, highlighting the need to take efforts and reforms to make growth more sustainable.
How do you slice and dice it between the government's debt burden and the private sector, where there's a lot of different kinds of activity going on in the lending markets?
Right. Well, I think you're right to point out that the rise in non-financial corporate debt is a concern. Right now, our focus is mainly on the state-owned enterprises to ensure that they face hard budget constraints and to look for ways to limit the subsidies to these enterprises to make them more market-oriented and to allow the markets to function more properly.
You mentioned in the briefing that inter-regional trade is a big positive and that it helps to create a lot of wealth among the middle classes, spurs domestic consumption, and is also just generally just helping out in that region. Can you outline why you think this is something so positive to highlight at this time?
Well, global trade has been a very important factor for Asia. It's helped lift millions of people out of poverty and improve living standards across the region. You're right that Asia is much more export-oriented than other regions in the world and has benefited tremendously, not just in terms of exports, but also in terms of investment and transfers of technology. Regional integration is also an important part of that globalization story. For example, you mentioned China. I mean, the role of China has increased dramatically over the past 10 to 15 years. In 2010, China accounted for about 26% of trade in Asia. Now it's close to 40% of economic activity. So China and other countries in the region will continue to play an important role in that regional integration drive.
India representing, as you say, about 13% of global growth, that has stalled a little bit recently with all of these financial reforms. Are you satisfied, though, that going forward, India has the right structures in place to ensure that they can continue to benefit from some pretty strong economic growth?
Right. I think the economic outlook for India remains pretty positive. We are projecting growth to accelerate to 7.6% next year. You're right, we downgraded growth somewhat for this year, but that reflects two temporary factors. First is the denomination scheme and the resulting cash shortages, but we feel that the impact of that is largely dissipated by now. The second is the rollout of the nationwide goods and services tax, which will have a long-term benefit by helping to unify the national markets. And there we are seeing signs that activity is beginning to recover. Industrial production, PMI are looking up in August, which suggests that we are on the path for a gradual recovery. So my sense is that this temporary disruption is a blip in a fairly positive outlook for India. But you're right, there's still much more work that needs to be done. And here I would highlight three areas. First is the need to address the weaknesses in the corporate and banks' balance sheets by accelerating the restructuring of non-performing loans and recapitalizing the public sector banks. Second would be to address the large infrastructure gap and supply bottlenecks in the economy. And third is to pursue vigorous structural reforms. And one of the main themes of our report is that this favorable economic outlook provides a window of opportunity to pursue difficult reforms, particularly in the area of the structural reforms. In India, it would be things like improving labor participation, particularly for women, improvements to the business environment to allow for more private investment and employment opportunities.
So there's been a lot of talk at these meetings about the potential impacts of a more inward-looking anti-globalization policies. That's been talked about much in reference to the United States and the new administration. But do you think these kind of winds of anti-globalization, as it were, could start to impact Asia as well?
Well, you're right. Asia has been a major beneficiary of globalization and global trade. And by its nature of being open to investment in trade, it is at risk of inward-looking policies and protectionism. That being said, Asia, I think, also needs to look inward and find ways to make growth more sustainable, but also more inclusive, to spread more evenly and broadly the benefits of globalization. That would include structural reforms to look for ways to deregulate closed sectors, particularly in the services, to invest more in training and education to allow workers to benefit from the new jobs and the new economy, and to liberalize further FDI regimes in order to benefit from the technology transfers from around the world.